Bong's Sirabun. Siriacorn Sirabun, affectionately called Bong by her family and friends, was an energetic and outgoing student at Borneo Heights College. Known for her deep passion for education, music, and dance, her life was tragically interrupted by an unexplained disappearance in February. This event left everyone who knew her, from her family in the Melbourne suburbs to people across all of Australia, desperately searching for answers amidst a sea of puzzling evidence. In an effort to provide more clarity based on available facts and situational analysis, this investigation delves into Bong Sirabun's disappearance in the Borneo area, unraveling the mysteries that followed. Bong was born on December 30, 1997, just after Christmas, in Ubon Ratchathani, a province in northeastern Thailand. She was the second daughter in her family, following her older sibling, Siriporn, or Pang as she was affectionately called. Unfortunately, the once happy family of four didn't remain intact for long. The relationship between Bong's mother and father deteriorated, and he eventually left when the girls were still quite young. As their father gradually faded from their lives, Bong and her sister Pang spent most of their time under the care of their mother, Benita. For several years, the sisters adjusted to their life with their mother until February 2004, when Benita met Fred Pattison, an Australian traveler. Fred had fallen in love with Thai culture in the 1990s and made it a point to travel back and forth between Australia and Thailand every year. During one of these visits, Fred and Veneta unexpectedly connected, and their friendship blossomed into a deep, healthy relationship. Over the next 2 years, the couple maintained a long-distance relationship, and in February 2006, Fred moved to Thailand, intending to stay permanently after he and Veneta married. Both Bong and Pang embraced Fred's presence in their lives, welcoming him as a loving father figure. Fred referred to them as his own daughters, and they cherished the connection with him. However, despite the strong familial bonds, the financial side of their new marriage struggled. Fred and Veneta attempted to start a small business manufacturing awnings, but the venture faced significant challenges. Unfortunately, the market proved too sparse for the venture to succeed, and the promising business quickly fell into failure. In an effort to lessen the family's losses, Fred returned to Australia and worked as a fitter for a Cadbury factory in Victoria. In February 2008, Veneta, Pang, and Bong joined him in Australia, and the couple worked tirelessly to secure a better future for the girls. Veneta found a job to support the family, ensuring that the sisters would receive a proper education, while she and Fred worked toward the dream of eventually returning to Thailand. As a result, Pang and Bong were enrolled in the Borneo Heights School District, located in the bustling suburb of Byronia in Melbourne, Victoria. Bong began 4th grade at Byronia Heights Primary School and quickly made friends, one of whom was Jaya Mai Hillard. Jia remained close with Bong throughout primary school and into high school. Jia later described Bong to reporters as an incredibly kind and compassionate young woman. She shared that Bong always radiated happiness, rarely losing her smile. This joyful spirit was one of the reasons Bong could make friends so easily, and it was why she and Jia got along so well. Bong had no fear and embraced challenges and new experiences without hesitation. Although she was naturally reserved, she was incredibly polite, and once she became comfortable in a new environment, she would thrive, radiating energy and joy. Another friend, Layla Preston, would later describe how Bong genuinely enjoyed school, feeding off the creativity of others while nurturing her own imagination. While Bong excelled in mathematics and science, her true passions lay in the arts, particularly dance and drama. At the time, her favorite artist was Justin Bieber, alongside various K-pop groups. In 2011, Bong had been rehearsing a dance routine with Jia Mai, which she had choreographed herself. This project was particularly close to her heart, and Jia Mai could sense Bong's excitement about showcasing their hard work. This was why Jia Mai struggled to comprehend the events that unfolded later that June, when Bong disappeared on a seemingly normal Thursday morning walk to school. It was a quiet, unsettling moment in the streets of Byronia under the early morning sun. Now let's review the timeline of events leading up to the unsolved disappearance of Bong Sirabun. Since her high school years began, Bong had been walking to Borneo Heights College on her own, a routine that was permitted by both her mother and stepfather. The Sirabun family lived on Elsie Street, just a short 10-minute walk from the school. It was a familiar and easy route for Bong, and she often made the trek alongside her classmates and close friends, including Taylor and of course Jia Mai. Jia Mai and Bong even had a spot at a nearby park where they would meet on their way to and from school, sometimes sharing snacks or chatting about the latest happenings. However, on the morning of June 2, 2011, Taylor told her brother that she was going to walk with him to school, when he asked if she wanted to head to Bong's house and walk together instead. It wasn't unusual for Taylor to walk with her brother, as she and Bong didn't always walk to school together. That same Thursday morning, Bong's alarm clock went off sometime after 7 a.m. She got out of bed, put on her usual school uniform, and had egg rice soup for breakfast. Around 8 a.m., Bong's stepfather Fred returned home from his graveyard shift at the Cadbury factory. He went into a back room while Bong continued getting ready for the day. By 8:30 a.m., Bong said goodbye to Fred and left the house, just as she did every other school day. A short time later, a neighbor spotted Bong heading east down their road toward Albert Avenue. The neighbor would later tell authorities that Bong appeared to be in good spirits and showed no signs of distress, dressed in her usual school uniform and a blue raincoat. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Bong's Sarabin. A few minutes after that, it is assumed that Bong reached the end of Elsie Street where it meets the busy Albert Avenue. She crossed through traffic every day and was likely heading southwest, making her usual right turn. After walking 1 block along Albert Avenue, Bong is thought to have turned left onto Harcourt Road, a quieter, less busy street compared to Albert Avenue. At 8:55 a.m., another neighbor reportedly spotted Bong walking along Harcourt Road, near the intersection with the Monco Street cul-de-sac. This spot was just 130 meters from the gate at the end of Monco Street, which led to Baronia Heights College, the school Bong and her friends would enter each morning. It remains uncertain whether Bong ever reached that gate that day, and the Harcourt Road sighting was never confirmed by the police. When school began, both Baronia Heights College staff and Bong's friends assumed she was absent for the day, as her excellent attendance record suggested no reason for her to miss class. Due to this assumption, Bong's parents, Vanita and Fred, believed she had made it to school safely, and no alarms were raised throughout the day. It wasn't until around 3:40 p.m. that afternoon when Vanita began to wonder where Bong was, noting that her daughter was usually home by that time. As the clock struck 4 p.m., the phone rang at the Sarah Boone household. Fred answered the call, expecting nothing out of the ordinary, only to be surprised when he heard Jeremiah Hillard's voice on the other end. Jeremiah asks Fred if she could speak with Bond to catch up on what she missed and discuss what was coming up at school. Fred, confused, asks why Jeremiah hadn't spoken to Bong earlier at school, to which Jeremiah explains that Bong had never shown up. It's then that both Jeremiah and Bong's parents realize, to their shock, that Bong has gone missing without anyone noticing. Within minutes, Vanita and Fred rush to their car and head to Baronia Heights College. There, the principal confirms that Bong was absent that day. At 4:20 p.m., the distressed couple arrives at the Knox police station. The officers advise them to contact all relatives and close friends to see if Bong might have gone to stay with someone. However, their efforts to reach anyone familiar with Bong yield no results. Undeterred, Vanita and Fred visit Jeremiah and ask her to help contact Bong's friends later that evening to gather more information. Jeremiah suggests checking the park where Bong and she often met on their way to and from school, but there is no sign of Bong there either. Throughout the night of June 2nd and into the early hours of June 3rd, Vanita and Fred go to each of Bong's friends' houses in person, desperately hoping for any updates or clues. Nobody shares anything useful, and after the round-robin of cold calls, the distressed couple return to Knox Police Station. As the day of June 3rd progresses, an official search goes underway. The Knox PD canvasses the area, knocking on the door of every neighborhood home, while distributing missing persons flyers across the town and its neighboring suburbs. The streets are rapidly filled with search and rescue volunteers. By the time the evening news rolls around, multiple broadcast stations have heard about the hunt for Bong Sarabun and blast her story on all the major networks. Reporters are diligent in asking the public for help, and it seems a real momentum is building. Over the next few days, the investigators pore over hours upon hours of CCTV footage from area cameras found at local businesses and public transportation stations. They also pay visits to all registered sex offenders in Victoria, feeling more and more that Bum's disappearance is at the hands of a kidnapper. The days turn to weeks, and authorities send officers into the Dandenong Rangers National Park and other mountainous woodlands to search for Bum. Despite multiple attempts, no clues are pulled from the nature reserves or hiking trails. Around the same time in February, 2 separate teenage girls come forward with testimonies relating to kidnapping attempts in the days after Bong went missing. However, either story is believed to be related to Bong's case after one was proven to be a hoax. In October of that year, 4 months after Bong's vanishing, police put together the Puma Task Force, a special rank of detectives to focus on the manhunt for Bong Sarabun. Puma is the first major focus group in a police investigation since 2003 in Melbourne, Australia. Over the next 2 years, the Puma task force receives over 900 calls, investigates 250 known sex offenders, searches over 1,000 homes, and collects over 1,100 pieces of evidence. However, they find nothing substantial and the case continues to grow cold. In February, the task force is shut down and all of its files and findings are handed back to homicide detectives of local police ranks. Years go by and various leads are presented to investigators. Yet a lot of the calls are proven to be hoaxes, including false confessions made by Melbourne locals. On the 5-year anniversary of Bong's disappearance, police turned to the public asking for help in clearing up a couple of alleged sightings of Bong back in February. However, nothing of merit comes through. In the years following Bong's disappearance, both law enforcement and her friends and family have remained determined to find answers. They continue to believe that someone knows what happened to the 13-year-old schoolgirl and have offered a $1 million reward for information leading to her discovery. Detectives and sleuths alike work tirelessly, hoping for that breakthrough that will reveal what happened to Bong. As with many missing persons cases involving children, Bong's case saw an outpouring of potential sightings in the days following her disappearance, many of which were reported by concerned citizens who had noticed something unusual. These reports were often based on fleeting impressions and lacked solid evidence, as is common when tragedy strikes a community and emotions run high. However, not all reports can be dismissed. In June 2016, detectives revealed 2 separate testimonies that caught their attention. Both accounts shared strikingly similar details, involving a man with various tattoos and a white car. Both sightings occurred between 15 and 30 minutes after Bong left her home in the Boronia suburb on the morning she vanished. The first of these sightings took place around 8:45 a.m., approximately 15 minutes after Bong's departure. The witness reportedly saw a young Asian girl matching Bong's appearance looking out the back window of a white Ford Falcon, either an EA or an EF manufactured sometime between 1988 and 1996. The white car was seen heading east at the intersection of Boronia Road and Florestan Road, driven by an older white male in his 50s or 60s, sporting slicked back brown hair in a rock and roll style, and tattoos all over his arms, including a noticeably colorful tattoo on the upper section of his left arm near the shoulder. There are also some reports that state the driver was wearing a blue singlet. However, this has not been confirmed. The second sighting took place around 15 minutes after the first, between 8:45 a.m. and 9 a.m. on June 2nd, likely 30 minutes after Bong left home. The big difference with this testimony is it came near the town of Rowville on Napoleon Road, an area roughly 9 to 10 kilometers south of Boronia. The eyewitness told police they saw a girl matching Bong's description sitting in the passenger seat of a white station wagon as it progressed through the morning traffic. From memory, the witness described the white vehicle as a Holden HQ Kingswood, an older model originating from somewhere between 1971 and 1973. The driver of the station wagon was also a white male, but appearing to be more middle-aged, in his 30s or 40s. The witness couldn't tell if the man was balding or just had incredibly light-colored hair, but did mention he showed tattoos covering his neck and arms like sleeves. What he was wearing couldn't be discerned either. While most investigators believe that these sightings are separate instances and likely disconnected, they could technically be of the same car, driver, and horrifyingly enough, the same passenger. If the first sighting did occur at 8:45 a.m., it's possible that it could have made its way southbound on the Napoleon Road and headed towards Rovo by 9 a.m. in order for the second sighting to take place. We have checked various mapping and GPS resources, and at least in 2020 conditions, the drive from the intersection of Boronia and Florestan Road to the southernmost point of Napoleon Road at 8:45 a.m. on a weekday commute is between 11 and 15 minutes. We assume the traffic patterns haven't changed drastically enough since 2011 to suggest it wouldn't have been possible 9 years ago on the morning of June 2nd to make this trip, thus providing the possibility that the first and second sightings are of the same vehicle. It is also worth considering one of the witnesses misread the make and model of the car, or didn't get a good enough look at the driver to properly account for their age and hairstyle. That being said, a Kingswood station wagon and a 1988 Ford Falcon really don't look too much alike in suggesting someone mistook a 60-year-old man with slicked back dark hair for a 35-year-old man with short blonde hair seems a little far-fetched. Thus, we don't firmly believe the sightings to be connected or reflecting of the same situation. However, we, like the police, do believe there are good odds that at least one of them could involve the real-life Bong Sarabin. We therefore ask that if anyone recognizes these descriptions of either the white cars and/or the tattooed men, please reach out to the proper authorities. These sightings have not been ruled out as of today and could be the major clue to taking the next step in finding Bong and bringing closure. Let's now take a look at the most prominent theories surrounding the unsolved disappearance of Bong Siribun. Like many missing children and teen cold cases, parents and guardians are always questioned in the early days of an investigation. As history suggests, many kids who disappear do so at the hands of their caretaker or family member. Thus, the first person both police and bystanders alike looked to for possible suspicion was Fred Patterson, Bung's stepfather and paternal role model. An anonymous source, most likely a fellow Baronia neighborhood resident, tipped off authorities that they had witnessed Fred digging around their LC Street home in the weeks that followed Bung's disappearance. When law enforcement approached Fred as a suspect, he happily complied, and he and Vanetta allowed detectives to search every nook and cranny of their home, including excavation around their property. Police found zero evidence to suggest that their parent was responsible or held any troubling secrets, and authorities thanked them for their openness and cooperation. However, it didn't dampen the whispers spreading around town that Fred was up to no good. With many people questioning without fair evidence his motives in embedding himself in Thai culture and bringing back 3 women to Australia with him. There were suspicions that Fred had hidden motives in his relationship with his wife and 2 daughters, fueled by prejudice and insecurities surrounding interracial marriage. As the case developed, these biases gave rise to elaborate theories, some even suggesting Fred might be involved in Bong's disappearance. However, the investigation quickly shifted focus, and police considered Bong's birth father, still living in Thailand, as a potential suspect. International law enforcement agencies were brought in to trace this lead. But ultimately, it led nowhere, and Bong's father was cleared of any involvement just as swiftly as he was initially suspected. By the June 2011, it was clear that Bong had not disappeared voluntarily. She had likely been abducted. As the case progressed into July, investigators' suburbs. 2 young women came forward with testimonies about attempted kidnappings in the weeks surrounding Bong's disappearance. The first report came from a 16-year-old girl in Ringwood, a town just 10 minutes away from Baronia. On June 21, 2011, she told police that a blue sedan had pulled up alongside her as she walked along Ringwood Road. The male driver had rolled down his window and tried to entice her into the car, but the girl refused, and the driver continued down the road, pulling into the hard shoulder ahead of her. The girl continued walking, and as she passed the blue sedan, the male driver exited the car and grabbed her arm from behind. In a stunning feat of courage, the 16-year-old girl fought off the would-be abductor, scratching and clawing at the offender until he let go. Once out of his grip, the girl sprinted into the nearby shrubbery and camouflaged herself from the man's view. A few moments later, he got back into his blue sedan and drove away, never to be seen again. When describing the man to authorities, the girl said he was in his late 50s or early 60s, sporting dark-colored clothes, graying hair, and most notably, decaying teeth. The best comparison she could make with his appearance in general was to that of a man from Southern European descent. From a broader perspective, the timing of the abduction attempt did not sit well with investigators who were worried about a serial offender. However, other detectives pointed out the more detailed inconsistencies. While the 2 neighborhoods are close in comparison with the rest of the country, Bam was Asian while this girl was white. In addition, Bam's disappearance came in the early morning, where this girl was approached in the afternoon. Of course, these points didn't disprove any connection, but it was enough to raise the eyebrows of everyone involved. Then came the second testimony that seemed to confirm everyone's worst nightmare. Just over a week later, on June 29th, a second young girl alerted authorities of an attempted abduction. This girl was just 11 years old but was of Asian descent and lived in Baronia as well, even knowing Bong personally from playing around the neighborhood. The specific details of the kidnapping attempt were not clarified. However, law enforcement did say they were similar to the Ringwood case, and released the sketch of the alleged perpetrator, as described by the 11-year-old girl. The man was older, in the same age range as the Ringwood offender, wore a matching red and dark gray sweatsuit as well as white-rimmed glasses, and most creepily of all, a surgical mask. After the public caught a glimpse of the disguised attacker, Baronia skyrocketed around Melbourne at large. Children were no longer allowed outside by themselves, and the streets were patrolled by cops and citizens alike, all hoping to get their hands on this newly arrived serial kidnapper haunting the Baronia area. A tremendous amount of resources by the Knox Police Department was put forth into this specific investigation, with the details between Bong and the second girl's cases signaling to even the most expert officials that a serious situation had surfaced. That was until the July 2011, when the 11-year-old girl revealed to her parents, and then to police, that she had fabricated her entire story regarding the attempted abduction. There was no man in the surgical mask, and everyone was left right back where they started. So despite this false lead, is it possible there was a serial criminal active in the streets of Melbourne that February? While it can't be ruled out, it's now thought to be highly unlikely. The only known cases of missing teenage girls, or at least attempts of such to happen in that area, and at that time were the cases of Bong Sarabhan and the unidentified 16-year-old Caucasian girl a week later. Without the support of a third abduction, there were too many holes between the other two profiles to draw a concrete connection. Serial kidnappers almost always target victims of the same race and with the same modus operandi, such as a preferred time of day. It may not seem like a big deal that the Ringwood girl was just 3 years older, but the contrast of physical appearance between a 13-year-old Asian girl and a 16-year-old Caucasian girl would be too great to draw meaningful conclusions. Had there been other attempts, more data points could be infused in the analysis to show investigators if there truly was a boogeyman-like character prowling the neighborhoods. But as it stands, we must conclude that the Ringwood abduction attempt was probably not related to Bong's disappearance, and was at the hands of a different perpetrator. So of course, we arrive at the grand question, who could that perpetrator be? Australia isn't necessarily known for its long history with serial killers or disastrous rates of violent crime, but it still has its fair share of criminals and potential repeat offenders. The most oft-theorized connection in regards to Bong is that of infamous child serial rapist, Mr. Cruel, whose horrifying moniker needs very little explanation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Mr. Cruel was an anonymous Australian man who broke into the houses of 3 young girls, an unidentified 11-year-old girl from Lower Plenty, 10-year-old Sharon Wills of Ringwood, and 13-year-old Nicola Linus of Canterbury, and gagged, binded, and assaulted them, sometimes kidnapping them to an undisclosed location before releasing them in a nondescript public location hours later. All 3 cases happened under the cloak of darkness between 11:30 p.m. and 5:30 a.m., all in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Mr. Cruel never left behind forensic evidence and conducted covert surveillance on each family before breaking into their homes. He was so intelligent, he used red herrings to distract police and throw off detectives while threatening to kill his victims if they acted up during his attacks. Mr. Cruel was known for his tailored black balaclava he wore during one of his crimes, as depicted in the widely circulated and spine-chilling police sketch, and has had over $1 million worth of rewards offered by police for any information that might lead to his identification or arrest. He was the Australian version of the Golden State Killer and thought to have had over a dozen other victims before the 3 confirmed and connected rapes starting in 1987. Another suspected victim of Mr. Cruel came in the fall of 1991 when on April 13th, an unidentified male abducted 13-year-old Carmine Shawn of Templestowe, a classmate of an earlier victim, Nicola Linus. Carmine had been taken at knife point, but unlike the other 3 confirmed victims, she wasn't found until a year later when her body was discovered with 3 gunshot wounds to the head. To this day, authorities have neither confirmed nor denied a connection between Mr. Cruel and Carmine's unsolved murder. But until it solves, the similarities have to be taken into account. Carmine was of the same age as the other girls, lived in the same area as the other girls, and was taken at knife points and killed by a handgun. The 2 weapons preferred by Mr. Cruel during his reign of terror. The only major difference was that Carmine was of Asian descent, doubling as the sign that Bong could be a victim of Mr. Cruel too. While it took place 20 years after the peak of Mr. Cruel's crimes, Bong disappeared in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne without a trace, hinting that her kidnapper had planned her abduction. So it would appear to have happened in an instant with 0 witnesses. The Carmine was indeed killed by Mr. It's possible that the case could have marked the beginning of a serial predator targeting young Asian schoolgirls, following a pattern similar to that of many serial criminals who evolved from rapists to murderers, much like the Golden State Killer. However, there are several factors that argue against any involvement from Mr. Cruel. The biggest point is his usual operating pattern. Mr. Cruel typically committed his crimes under the cover of darkness, spacing his attacks a year or 2 apart in order to gather information about his victims before striking. Additionally, he did not strike again for decades, and there was no sign of his presence in the Melbourne area between the turn of the millennium and February 2011. Bomb was taken in broad daylight, during rush hour, on semi-busy streets in a neighborhood where many residents were awake and alert. For Mr. Cruel to have changed his methods to such a drastic degree, and after so many years, would be illogical unless he had spent the 2 decades in hiding, building the courage to attack during the day without his trademark balaclava. This makes it unlikely that Mr. Cruel was involved in Bong's case. There are simply too many differences between the timing of his known crimes and Bong's abduction. That being said, we must ask if there could be other notorious individuals in the Melbourne area responsible for Bong's disappearance. One such person of interest emerged in August 2012, when a 24-year-old Australian man called the police claiming to have inside knowledge about Bong Sarabhan's fate. The man admitted to accidentally hitting Bong with his car the morning of July 2, 2011 and disposing of her body by burying her at a local reserve instead of alerting the authorities due to fear of persecution. However, there simply wasn't enough information to keep him in confinement, and he was released after his confession. Then 2 months later in October of 2012, the 24-year-old was detained and interrogated once again, but for whatever reason was released the second time without enough proof to keep him imprisoned. By the end of the year, law enforcement announced the man was no longer considered a major suspect after securing no other information to support his claim. Man could not provide any hard proof that he had hit Bong, and when he led the cops to the reserve where her body was supposedly buried, the detectives found absolutely no forensic or even circumstantial evidence to support his claim. They even compounded the man's vehicle that was said to have been involved but once more found nothing. The person of interest tag was still applied, but according to the task force, his confession was doubted and the team moved on to pursue other leads. In all honesty, that's probably the smartest move. For a man to hit and kill a young girl on her walk to school, it would have had to happen on a busy road where the man could have been going speeds high enough to inflict death. The only road buying travel that could theoretically cause this was busy enough that not even the most skilled criminal could have snuck the body away without anyone seeing or leaving behind any physical clues and then burying the body miles away in a public reserve. This man was more than likely mentally ill, looking for the spotlight in some ill sense, and made a false confession to gain attention. He may still be a person of interest in the eyes of the police, but we fully believe his testimony to be a real-world red herring. Too many high-profile cold cases see their fair share of people coming forward with manufactured information to gain 15 minutes of fame. And this is regrettably one of those instances. Another person of interest was first detailed by the folks over at Unsolved on their own profiling of Bung's disappearance. They posited the theory that noted serial rapist and murderer, Gregory Keith Davies, could somehow be involved. Davies' criminal background began all the way back in 1968 with convictions of fraud and larceny, then exploded into attempted murder with intent to cause grievous bodily harm in 1971 against a 14-year-old girl. Davies was acquitted on the basis of insanity claims by the defense and held under detainment by the governor until November of 1982. His release then led to the rape and murder of Kylie Marbury, a 6-year-old girl, 2 years later in 1984. However, because Davies could provide an alibi, police never collected his DNA after interviewing him, and he walked free for over 30 years. Until in 2016, authorities finally recovered a DNA sample and matched it with DNA found at Marbury's crime scene. Davies pleaded guilty to imprisonment, rape, and murder charges a year later, and he now sits in prison without the chance of parole until February 1945. Davies is an interesting suspect because of the wide range of open timeline in which he could have committed other child murders. Various brave women have come forward in the few years since his arrest claiming to have survived multiple assaults at the hands of Davies. Police are on their side too, understanding Davies to probably be the perpetrator of numerous other crimes, including those left unsolved. While Davies hasn't confessed to anything related to Bum, his unknown activity during the time she vanished, as well as his age range in selecting victims, could point to him being a credible suspect. There's also another unsettling connection between Davies and Bong's case. If you'll remember the 2 sightings of Bong we previously examined, you'll remember how both of those sightings involved a white vehicle and a male driver. Well, it just so happens in the 30 years between detainments, Davies has been confirmed to have owned and operated an older modeled white Holden HQ station wagon. Now Davies does not match the description of the driver in the Holden station wagon from the second Bunny sighting, but he does match the driver in the first sighting who drove a like modeled white sedan. Davies does not have a colorful tattoo. However, it is not outside the realms of possibility that the details of these 2 sightings were inaccurate and that the white car that was driven by a man in his 60s was a Holden HQ. Davies would have been 62 in 2011 and could have been wearing something around his neck that could appear as a tattoo from a brief glimpse of someone who saw him driving by. While it is undeniably enticing to believe Davies was the man in the sightings and Bong was the girl in the back seat of the white car, it is also a textbook example of coincidental circumstance. Keep in mind that Davies was active in the northern Melbourne suburbs about 30 kilometers northwest of the Baronian neighborhoods. Yes, it certainly is possible that he could have been active in surrounding communities, but it also would have required unbelievable amounts of stealth and learning of the Baronia streets and traffic patterns. Again, the potential does exist, but it would require us to accept that Davies avoided leaving a single trace of evidence as a 62-year-old man when he was unable to do so in previous murders as a younger, more able-bodied person. Of course, this is all speculation, but until he is proven otherwise, Davies must still be considered as a strong person of interest. And because he is still alive, the chance of a confession exists if he is indeed guilty. Before we divulge our hypothesis of Bong Siribun's unsolved disappearance, we want to make known that our conclusions are purely logical speculation based on evidence, circumstance, and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each episode, and we do not attempt to promise certainty or an expert guarantee on the findings we reach in closing. We simply observe, research, and report. In the case of Bong Siribun, we agree with investigators that Bung was kidnapped from the streets of her route to school by a skilled and highly intelligent criminal with a sick perversion for her specifically. How did this person find and single out Bong? It is hard to say. It was well known by police and Bong's friends and family that she was active on social media and the internet at large, owning more than one Facebook account, and always online in her spare time on the computer. While experts who dissected her social media accounts and browser history say, there was nothing suspicious to suggest she met someone online. It's also possible someone found one of her profiles and started stalking her digitally. If not, whoever it was, the kidnapper could also have lived in one of the neighborhoods traversed by Bong on her way to school. The offender most likely followed her discreetly each day either on foot or by car, absorbing the atmospheric conditions and making detailed notes of the schedules of those around them. They probably canvassed the streets like this for weeks, maybe even months, making sure that they had her patterns down to 80 and was 100% confident they could strike when no one was looking. Then they waited for the perfect opportunity when the weather was bad to keep less wandering neighbors inside and less traffic on the roads. In addition, the perpetrator had to have known Bong walked with friends, and thus needed a morning when she walked alone in order to avoid any witnesses. When June 2nd came and the rains fell and Bong isolated herself on her final journey to Baronia Heights College. Tragedy struck like a bolt of lightning with the monster themselves implementing infinite hours of planning to commit the unthinkable crime. So who could this evil kidnapper be? We believe that rather than a serial offender, this specific perpetrator was only targeting Bong specifically. And while they may have been a petty criminal previously, they weren't snatching children off the street left and right. Could this kidnapper have been the same man who attempted to take that 16-year-old girl on June 21st? Cannot be ruled out. However, this person was probably only interested in Bong, explaining why there was no string of similar disappearances in Boronia or Melbourne at large around that time frame. It could have been a teacher at school, a close but not too close family friend, a neighbor with their blinds closed and one eye looking out. It could have been, and probably is, someone who the police overlooked who doesn't have an obvious record that screams child abductor. And that may be the most frightening of all. The bomb was taken at the hands of someone still among us who appears to be someone just like you or I, never suspected to be holding a dark, deadly secret. Whoever it is, they most likely left Melbourne to avoid local police and making a mistake, now watching from a distance, telling themselves they've won when they most certainly have not. Together with combined courage and persistence, we can put a spotlight on whoever that person is and find Bong Siribun hopefully alive to bring her home to a family and community whose only wish is for justice. In the midst of the uncertainty surrounding Bong's disappearance, it is important to remember the brightness of her life and the many ways in which she touched the world. Bong was not just an exceptional student, but also an insightful artist and a compassionate friend. Her passion for life was evident in all she did. She adored the beach, spending hours swimming in the waters behind her grandparents' home, where the sunlight reflected off the ocean in the same way her eyes sparkled with wonder. Bong expressed herself through both drawing and dance, pouring her creativity into vibrant works that spoke to her soul. Beyond her own personal endeavors, Bong was always ready to lend a hand. She enjoyed gardening on weekends and sharing joyful moments with her friends, like ice cream sundaes. What stood out the most about Bong was her ability to find happiness effortlessly and connect with anyone around her. She lifted up those who needed it, offering support without hesitation. Bong Siribun was on a path to making an impact on her community and the world, one filled with boundless potential. Her kind heart and vibrant spirit would have left a lasting legacy. As we continue searching for answers, we must hold on to the hope that she will be found, and one day her promise will be realized.
After making a late-night roadside help call in January 2013, 26-year-old Texas father Brandon Mason Lawson disappeared. When his car was discovered abandoned, what had started out as a typical night took an enigmatic turn. Brandon's voice shook in terror as he called 911 in a panic, whispering that he was being pursued and desperately needed assistance. Brandon remained a mystery despite a great deal of searching and investigation, leaving his friends and family in a desperate search for answers. What actually transpired that evening, and who was he fleeing from? Let's investigate the enigma. Brandon Lawson was an oil field worker from San Angelo, Texas at the time of his disappearance. According to reports, he was a devoted partner to his girlfriend, Ledessa Lofton, whom he had dated for 10 years, and a loving father to 4 children. Ledessa was the stepmother of Brandon's oldest daughter and the mother of their 3 children. Brandon's recent drug relapse, which resulted in his inexplicable absences, caused Ledessa great concern. Their bond was forged over years of shared experiences and the difficulties of raising a family together, despite the usual ups and downs in their relationship. But Brandon, like a lot of young people, had his share of difficulties. He had previously abused drugs, particularly methamphetamines, but according to reports, he had been clean for roughly 6 months prior to the night of his disappearance. His friends and family knew him as a strong, industrious man who was trying to change his life. However, he had previously been overcome by the hold of addiction, and he was burdened by the strain of juggling his demanding work in the oil industry with his family life. The events leading to Brandon's disappearance began on the evening of August 8, 2013, when he and Ledessa got into a fight. It started off like any other evening. After a long day of work, Brandon got home in San Angelo between 10:45 and 11 p.m. Brandon and Ledessa got into a heated argument. Although it was initially unclear what specifically started the argument, Ledessa later disclosed that she became irritated and suspicious when Brandon failed to come home the night before. After the argument grew more heated, Brandon made the decision to leave the house at 11:30 p.m. About 3 hours' drive from San Angelo, he called his father and said he was coming to his home in Crowley, Texas. He left Ledessa behind and climbed into his silver Ford F-150 at 11:54 p.m. At the time, she didn't think much of it and assumed he would calm down and come back. Ledessa later reflected on the altercation in a 2018 interview, explaining that it was caused by a number of factors. The recent birth of their youngest son, which created additional stressors between them, and Brandon's rigorous work schedule, which involved more than 60 hours per week, were major contributing factors. Ledessa acknowledged the emotional weight of her words and conveyed her sincere regret for the argument. She acknowledged that she put a lot of the blame on herself. The memory of their most recent altercation still plagued her, and she remarked, "I will never get those words back." Brandon called his brother Kyle at around 12:30 a.m. on August 9 to let him know that he had run out of gas on Highway 277 close to the tiny town of Bronte. The town of Bronte is surrounded by a broad, rocky region of desert and hills. It is surrounded by rough, harsh terrain, including dry riverbeds, rocky outcrops, and steep hills. There aren't many people living there, and it's secluded. There aren't many services in the area, and cell phone service is scarce. During the night, the sky is so dark that only the stars can be seen. The wind is the only thing breaking the heavy silence. Being stuck in a location like this can quickly turn into a major issue. Brandon Lawson experienced precisely this on the evening of August 9, 2013. Just outside of Bronte, on Highway 277, his truck ran out of gas. All of a sudden, he found himself isolated in a remote location, vulnerable to the hostile surroundings. All he could do was wait for his brother. Kyle remembered that Brandon sounded uncontrollable during one of their calls. He informed Kyle that he was being pursued, which clearly caused concern. Brandon clarified that the Mexicans in the neighborhood were pursuing him when Kyle asked for more information. Kyle, still perplexed, inquired as to whether Brandon was hallucinating as a result of drug use, but Brandon denied it. Kyle didn't know what was happening, but he was worried. In order to assist Brandon, he hurried to Ledessa's house with his wife and their 4-year-old child to get a fuel can. Kyle continued to try to contact his brother while they were driving. However, Brandon never seemed able or willing to engage in a full conversation when they spoke. Kyle tried his hardest to communicate and gain a comprehensive understanding of Brandon's predicament, but their brief and fragmented exchanges added mystery to an already perplexing situation. One of the most important and perplexing pieces of evidence in the case is the distressing 911 call that Brandon made at 12:50 a.m. Due to routing errors, the 911 call was sent to a nearby nursing home in Robert Lee, Texas. Brandon's voice was erratic and panicked during the call. Some phrases stood out among his difficult-to-understand words. The dispatcher tried to question Brandon, who was obviously perplexed by the call, but his answers were jumbled and ambiguous. He appeared to be in a panic and said that he was being chased into the woods and that he needed help right away. Even though the call was unclear, it was clear that Brandon was upset and thought someone was chasing him. The phone logs that precede Brandon's disappearance are broken down as follows. Kyle left a voicemail at 12:51 a.m. after Brandon claimed he was being pursued. After their argument, Brandon attempted to call Ledessa, but was unsuccessful because she had left her phone in her car. When Kyle's wife called Brandon as well, and Kyle called him again without getting a response, the urgency increased. Brandon called his neighbor at 12:57 a.m., but this did not provide any answers. Brandon was contacted by a nursing home dispatcher regarding his previous 911 call at 1:04 a.m. Brandon then called Kyle 3 more times at 1:09 a.m. He informed Kyle that he was bleeding while running through a field during one of these calls. In a subsequent interview, Kyle stated that he didn't believe Brandon was gravely injured. He thought his brother had just tripped or been in a small mishap. Brandon then called Kyle one last time at 1:15 a.m. This would be the final calls he made from his phone before it became silent. That night is depicted as chaotic by this series of calls. Brandon was obviously in distress and was attempting to contact his neighbor, brother, girlfriend, and even 911. However, meaningful communication was almost impossible because of bad cell reception, his panic, and perhaps the hazardous and dark terrain. The uncertainty surrounding his last moments was further compounded by the confusion between his calls and his family's efforts to find him. When a truck driver called to report that Brandon's truck was parked dangerously on the side of the road, a Coke County Sheriff's deputy arrived at the scene at around 1 a.m. Kyle had also arrived at the scene by the time the deputy did, but Brandon was nowhere to be seen. During a phone conversation with Kyle at 1:18 a.m., Brandon claimed to be able to see both Kyle and the deputy from his hiding place, saying, "I can see you. I'm right here." However, neither Kyle nor the deputy were able to see Brandon anywhere near the truck or the surrounding area, which further complicated the situation. Kyle believed Brandon was attempting to elude the police because he had an active warrant for his arrest in Johnson County on a charge of drug possession with intent to deliver. Brandon didn't want to be caught, he reasoned, especially since the deputy was already there. Kyle and the deputy didn't have all the information necessary to comprehend what was actually going on because they were unaware that Brandon had called 911 earlier. Later, Kyle stated that he didn't believe he was in danger. Kyle made the decision to drive a short distance up the road after speaking with the deputy. After the deputy left, he parked farther down in the hopes that Brandon would emerge from hiding. After waiting there for 30 to 45 minutes, Kyle decided that everything was okay and departed for San Angelo. When Brandon failed to appear, Kyle went back to the location where his truck had run out of gas at around 5 in the morning on August 9. Once more, Brandon failed to show up when he called for his brother. A deputy reported that a small private search team had been assembled to find Brandon on August 11. A few days later, they searched until about noon without discovering anything significant. Having begun at about 8 a.m., the only hint they found was a tiny spot beneath a tree where it appeared someone had taken a seat. This location was visible from his truck and near the road. There were no additional indications of Brandon or his whereabouts, despite Kyle and the search team's best efforts, leaving his family with more questions than answers. Many theories have been proposed in the years following Brandon's disappearance. Some stem from the peculiarity of his last phone conversations, while others are based on the case's facts. The notion that Brandon might have been the victim of foul play is one of the most talked about theories. There has been conjecture that Brandon came into contact with someone or something dangerous on the evening of August 9, 2013, after he reported being chased into the woods in his 911 call. Some have even proposed that drug use may have played a role. People question whether Brandon was in danger, possibly a drug deal gone wrong or a run-in with violent people while stuck on the highway, given that he had used methamphetamines just before the incident. But this theory is called into question by the paucity of evidence. There were no reports of other cars in the vicinity at the time, and no evidence of a struggle was discovered close to his truck. Many people were left wondering whether foul play was involved, where it occurred and who was involved, because the scene surrounding the truck was oddly undisturbed. The idea that Brandon may have intentionally vanished is another theory that has gained some traction. At the time, his life was complicated. Maybe he took extreme action because of his tumultuous relationship with his girlfriend, personal problems, and legal troubles. According to some, Brandon might have taken advantage of the circumstance to flee his life and start over somewhere else. There is some circumstantial evidence to support this theory. The key to Brandon's pickup truck, which had been left partially over the white line on the road, was in his possession, alone. Law enforcement started looking into the incident shortly after the truck was towed on August 9, 2013, at around 8 a.m. Assigned to the case, Deputy Neal looked for indications of activity at a number of nearby properties. The deputy wanted to find out if Brandon might have sought shelter or water on any of these properties, many of which were only used during certain seasons, but Neal couldn't find any evidence that Brandon had been there. After Ledessa formally reported missing on August 13, Texas Ranger Nick Hanna, who was now in charge of the case, searched the area in a helicopter. Brandon was nowhere to be seen when they flew over the area close to Highway 277 and the Colorado River. One intriguing finding from the helicopter search was that there was enough exposed ground for someone who was lying down or hiding to have probably been seen from above. Deputies came to the conclusion that Brandon Lawson had left Coke County as a result of this. The deputy wrote in his final report that he didn't think Brandon was hiding or lost in the area. He based his conclusion on several factors. According to Kyle Lawson, Brandon was probably hiding in the brush close to his truck so the deputy wouldn't find him. Nevertheless, the truck and its surroundings showed no indications of foul play. Above all, Brandon and Ledessa's text messages from the night of his disappearance suggested a furious dispute. Neal thought Brandon most likely walked back to the road and hitched a ride from a passing car after he and Kyle left the scene. The idea that Brandon purposefully vanished has only grown stronger as a result of his ongoing absence over the years. The region was going through a serious drought when he vanished. They were able to identify small items like corn sacks from the air during aerial searches. They could have easily seen Brandon if he had been on the ground. In addition, the river in the region was incredibly low, only reaching knee-deep in its deepest sections. These circumstances implied that Brandon would have been discovered during their searches if he had been in the region. Brandon's active warrant for possession with intent to deliver was also mentioned by the deputy as a potential explanation for his disappearance. He surmised that Brandon might have chosen to flee in order to stay out of legal hot water. The fact that Brandon cashed in his $401,000 with Renegade Oil Services shortly before going missing, potentially as part of a disappearance plan, lends more credence to this theory. Kyle Lawson was asked to meet with Sheriff McCutcheon, Ranger Hanna, and a Johnson County investigator at the same location where Brandon's warrant had been issued several months after Brandon vanished. They interrogated Kyle about his role, asking whether he had hurt or assisted his brother in getting away. In the end, Kyle asked for a polygraph to clear his name. Kyle claims that he passed the test on hurting his brother, despite some inconsistencies brought on by coughing during the exam. The accidental death or lost in the wilderness theory is another explanation for his disappearance. Arid and rocky, Highway 277 is home to cacti, thorny bushes, and dangerous creatures like wild hogs and rattlesnakes. This belief appears to be supported by the thorough searches that have been conducted, but every lead has ended in disappointment, with no sign of him. According to the final theory, Brandon's recent use of methamphetamines may have caused him to suffer from drug-induced hallucinations or paranoia. Severe paranoia, disorientation, and unpredictable conduct are all possible side effects of methamphetamine, especially if the user has been up for a long time. Brandon may have fled into the wilderness in a confused state, and his references to people chasing him may have been the product of a drug-induced hallucination. The term paranoia describes a strong mistrust or fear of other people, frequently coupled with illogical ideas or convictions that someone or something is trying to hurt them. Even when there are no actual external threats, paranoia in the context of drug use can show up as an elevated sense of threat or danger. Brandon's strange phone calls may be explained by this theory, but it doesn't address the question of what happened to him after he fled his truck. Did the weather get to him? Did he get stuck somewhere inaccessible or fall into a ravine? His family was left in a difficult position after Brandon Lawson vanished, caught between hope and the harsh realities of life. Brad Lawson, his father, struggles with mixed feelings. He is plagued by nightmares in which Brandon is still alive, possibly coerced into slave labor by a cartel. Even though he is aware that the likelihood of Brandon surviving is remote, the possibility of foul play seems limitless, and Brad can't get rid of the thought that his son might still be out there somewhere. Is it possible that Brandon was being followed that evening? Did he encounter death when he entered private property? Or was it a crime of opportunity, where someone walked by, saw his weakness, and took advantage of him? Lisa Lofton can't stand the uncertainty. She worries that her kids won't ever know what happened to their father when they grow up, get married, or even start a family of their own. She is troubled by the memory of that night, particularly the altercation they had before he vanished. She battles this guilt every day after hurtful words were exchanged. The odd 911 call Brandon made that evening serves as their final connection to him. It serves as a painful reminder of his last moments for Ledessa and her kids. His two older daughters try to understand his words as they listen to the recording on YouTube, but it only makes their heartache worse. Brad is adamant that his son did not simply flee. He contends that Brandon was not forced to leave his family because the arrest warrant was insufficient. Brandon was always prepared to accept the consequences because he had previously dealt with legal issues. He actually had plans for the future, including beginning a new job the Monday after his disappearance that would pay more and come with the fact that none of Brandon's possessions, including his phone, wallet, keys, or even his shoes, have ever been located only serves to further complicate matters. How someone could vanish so totally without leaving any trace is beyond his brother's comprehension. The family's suspicion that foul play was involved is only strengthened by this. Ledessa is hopeful that someone will eventually come forward because she thinks that someone out there is aware of what happened to Brandon. She is still plagued by unresolved questions, such as the identity of the dispatcher who spoke to Brandon that evening and the trucker who reported his pickup. Ledessa thinks that these individuals may possess important hints that could ultimately clarify what transpired. Ledessa can't help but notice the ominous tone of Brandon's 911 call, even though she tells herself that his disappearance might have been an accident. She finds it hard to accept that someone would hurt the man she cherished so much. Help Find Brandon Lawson, a Facebook page created by Brandon Lawson's friends and family, has received a lot of support and attention since it was created. The page has more than 2,000 followers as of 2024, indicating that Brandon's unsolved disappearance has generated a lot of interest and concern. This website is a vital resource for disseminating news, details, and appeals pertaining to Brandon's case. It gives Brandon's family members a place to communicate with supporters, reminisce about Brandon, and coordinate efforts to keep his story in the public eye. The page encourages anyone with information regarding Brandon's whereabouts or the circumstances surrounding his disappearance to come forward, and plays a crucial part in the ongoing search for answers. Paula Boudreau, Ledessa's hired private investigator, has also been putting in a lot of effort to find hints. The sizable community that follows the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page frequently provides her with leads. Boudreau has encountered challenges while searching the land with cadaver dogs and helicopters. On their property, some landowners have refused to permit searches. Prior to 2022, there had been no leads or noteworthy advancements in the hunt for Brandon Lawson. But at Brandon's last known location, a small search team made a breakthrough in early 2022. They notified the authorities after finding a pile of his clothing. Human remains were discovered nearby shortly after. The Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page announced in October 2023 that the clothing discovered and initial DNA results suggested the remains were probably Brandon's. To compare the genetic markers from the remains with Brandon's father's DNA, more tests were being conducted. The Texas Ranger in charge of the case said he was cautiously optimistic that the remains would be identified. There have been no new developments regarding the identification as of October 2024. 11 years have passed since Brandon vanished, and his family is still looking for answers. Unfortunately, because of their advanced state of decomposition, these remains have not yet been definitively identified, leaving little material for identification. A portion of the remains are destroyed each time a sample is taken out and examined. For upcoming DNA testing, it is therefore imperative to preserve as much as possible. In an attempt to extract enough DNA, the remains have been sent to 2 labs, but the results have been negative thus far. The family is unable to provide additional information regarding the investigation's current status or the other options the Texas Rangers were considering in June 2023 for identifying the remains. The finding of Brandon Lawson's remains is likely to put an end to the tragic and enigmatic case of his disappearance. Even with this possible resolution, there are still a lot of unsolved questions regarding what happened that evening. Even though they are thankful for some closure, his family might never find all the answers they are looking for. The anguish of not knowing a loved one's fate and the unpredictability of life are both highlighted in Brandon's story. It highlights the necessity of continual enhancements to search and rescue operations, particularly in isolated regions such as West Texas. The memories of Brandon Lawson will live on in the hearts of his loved ones and everyone who has followed his tragic story, even though the whole truth may never be known. And that wraps up today's chilling story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Also, let me know in the comments, what part of this story shocked you the most? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
On December 6, 1975, a chilling discovery sent shockwaves through the quiet town. 2 citizens, innocently riding their motorcycles, stumbled upon a lifeless body in a desolate field at the eerie intersection of 100th Avenue and Lowell Boulevard. Little did they know, this grim find marked the beginning of an unsolved mystery that would haunt the community for nearly half a century. The woman was identified as Terry Becker. Becker grew up in Casper with her parents, a brother and a sister. She was a graduate of Kelly Walsh High School and worked for a newspaper for a time. She moved to Denver shortly after graduating. Her family said that she often lived life on the edge. They said she never met a stranger and would hold a conversation with anyone. Terry enjoyed painting and listening to music. On December 4th, 1975, Terry was last seen alive while hitchhiking to Brighton, Colorado, intending to visit her boyfriend incarcerated at Adams County Jail. After reportedly hitchhiking to the detention center, her exact whereabouts remained unknown. Her body was found 2 days later. It appeared that Terry's body had been dumped in the field, along with her clothing and personal items. An autopsy revealed she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Despite multiple investigations and reviews, the case remained unsolved until 2003, when a DNA sample of an unknown male was pulled from the evidence found at the crime scene. The DNA profile was entered into the CODIS. However, no matches were found. In 2013, Las Vegas Metro Police Department was reviewing a 1991 murder case of Sherry Bridgewater, who had been found raped and murdered in her apartment. They submitted the DNA found at the crime scene to CODIS, and to their surprise, it matched the unknown suspect in Terry Becker's murder. It was determined the suspect who murdered Terry Becker also murdered Sherry Bridgewater in Las Vegas. However, they did not know the suspect's identity at the time. In 2018, the case was submitted for genetic genealogy testing to identify a match through hereditary DNA analysis. After 5 years of research and testing, Thomas Martin Elliott was identified as a suspect in both murders. In October 2023, his body was exhumed and was positively identified as the killer in both cases in January 2024. Elliott had a lengthy criminal record and spent significant time in and out of prisons. He committed a burglary in Lakewood before murdering Terry. He would ultimately be convicted for 6 years in prison of the burglary. While in prison, Elliott was moved throughout the Department of Corrections system and was ultimately released from prison in Las Vegas in 1981. After his release, he proceeded to commit a crime against a child and received a 10-year sentence. He was again released in Las Vegas in 1991, where he would go on to murder Sherry Bridgewater. Thomas Elliott committed suicide on October 30th, 1991. Authorities are now retracing data to determine if additional cases may be linked to Thomas Elliott. Nellie Hicks was a 59-year-old woman who lived with a housemate in Newark, California. She had divorced her husband a decade ago and raised her family of 6 on her own. She worked as a 4th-grade teacher at Ashland School in San Lorenzo. On May 10, 1972, Nellie's housemate spoke with Nellie around 1 a.m. before retiring to her bedroom. Nellie dozed off on the living room sofa. It was the last time she was seen alive. 4 hours later, one of Nellie's sons woke up to find a horrifying scene. Nellie's bloodied, lifeless body laying on the sofa. He immediately notified the police. Nellie had been found partially naked and bludgeoned to death by a brick wrapped in pantyhose. The brutality was immediately apparent, with her head split open by the force of the blows. She had also been sexually assaulted. Police determined the killer entered the house through an unlocked sliding glass door and used manicure scissors to cut her dress and bra. Police believed the killer had knocked Nellie unconscious before sexually assaulting her. All the while, her son, his wife, and her housemate were asleep, unaware of the slaying. Nellie's wallet was missing. However, it was later found a few blocks away next to a pair of blood-stained panties. The only forensic evidence that police recovered were fingerprints that, for decades, were never tied to a specific person. Police interrogated her housemate, her family, her ex-husband, and the men she had dated. However, no one was ever charged. The case remained unsolved for more than half a century. In 1979, another murder occurred with the same modus operandi. Teresa Pica was a 48-year-old woman who lived with her children in Hayward, California. On May 15, 1979, Teresa's 10-year-old twin daughter woke up in their Edlow Drive home to find her mother slumped over the couch, face down. Her nightgown had been pulled up, exposing her legs. Her hands were bound behind her back with rope, and a blood-stained rock was discovered nearby. A shirt had been utilized to gag her, and it was observed that a front room window had been forcibly opened. A neighbor later reported hearing rustling near the home during the night. Pica's purse was missing, and her wallet, along with other belongings, were subsequently found in a neighbor's yard and in a garbage can down the street. Just like in Nellie's case, Teresa was sexually assaulted and murdered while 3 of her daughters were asleep in the house. Over the years, a number of people would be investigated in the case, but none were ever charged. Following Pica's murder, the Newark and Hayward police connected the crimes due to the identifiable pattern of behavior common to both cases. This led to the belief that solving one case would solve the other. Evidence was collected at both crime scenes. However, DNA testing did not exist at the time. In early 2000s, based on the DNA found at the crime scenes, a male DNA profile was developed and entered into CODIS. However, no matches were found. In 2021, the Hayward Police Department submitted forensic evidence to Othram in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram scientists successfully used forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive DNA profile for the unidentified suspect. And in February of 2024, Fred Bernard Farnham was identified as a suspect in both cases. Farnham had a lengthy criminal record. He grew up in the Central Valley, then moved to the South Bay in the 1950s. He served prison time after he was convicted of several sexual assaults in Sunnyvale and San Jose in the 1970s. He also lived in Nevada, Idaho, North Dakota, Alaska, and Oregon. Farnham died at the age of 73 in a hospital in 2007 before detectives were able to link him to the killings. Police believe Farnham could be responsible for other unsolved murders. The cases were solved after more than half a century. Mary Jane Croft Van Gilder was born on November 19, 1911, in Fairmont, West Virginia. She married her husband, James Wesley Van Gilder, on January 29, 1929. By the time World War II broke out, Mary gave birth to their 5th child, after their twins were stillborn in 1935. But her marriage to James was troubled, and in 1943, Mary moved to the Van Gilder family farm. It is unclear why James and Mary separated, but sources said Mary alleged her husband was alcoholic and abusive, although her children said they do not believe their father was abusive. In 1944, Mary moved to Plymouth, Ohio, and got a job as a forklift operator at the Wilkins Air Force Depot in Shelby. Mary did not own a vehicle. She got rides to and from work from coworkers. After moving to Ohio, Mary maintained contact with her children, mailing war bonds as well as letters and clothes. War bonds is an initiative by a government to fund military operations and spending by issuing debt for the public to purchase. Her children have no idea why she moved away and why she separated. Mary's oldest daughter, Anna Mae Van Gilder Rager, said, "In 1945, my mother sued my dad for divorce, which made me think she was wanting to get married again, but we found no answer to that." In 1945, Mary Jane sent a letter to West Virginia, asking her children to send the war bonds back to her in Plymouth. A few weeks later, she sent them her final war bond. It was the last time her family ever heard from Mary Jane. James filed for a divorce a few months later, but Mary never responded. When she failed to show up to court, Mary's divorce petition was withdrawn by her attorney in April 1946. James was granted the divorce and full custody of the children by a judge in West Virginia. By 1949, Mary's oldest daughter, Anna, started looking for her mother. It wasn't until May 5, 1952, that she would learn that her mother had left her employment at the Wilkins Air Force Depot on March 8, 1945, stating she needed to leave because of, quote, added household duties. Although she was never officially reported missing, her daughter Anna kept looking for her mother. In 2004, Anna found a new link to her mother's past after a newspaper in Ohio wrote a story about their search for Van Gilder. A man read the Plymouth Journal's article and emailed Anna that his father had worked with Mary between 1943 and 45. However, they do not know what happened to her after that. In April 2018, Anna's daughter, Mary's granddaughter, finally reported Mary missing to the police. The investigating officer, Adam Turner, said, "That pain, that desperation, and that need to know is still very fresh for Anna. The not knowing is worse than the knowing. When somebody's missing, you're left in limbo." Adam began working on the case and obtained Mary's military personnel file and published it online to see if it would help generate some leads. Soon, a civilian sleuth pointed him to a name on a document in the file that would prove crucial to solving the case. The sleuth came across the name Percy L. Sebrin. It turned out when Mary was promoted to high lift fork operator, she took the position from Sebrin and likely received training from him. Searching Sebrin's history on findagrave.com, Adam learned the man died in Kansas City, Missouri in 1969. It also showed he was married to a Mary Jane Sebrin, who was born on November 19, 1911, and died in 1990. Both were buried in Forest, Louisiana. Sebrin was run over and killed by a train. The couple lived in Arkansas and had 2 children. Curiously, the first child was born in December 1945, just 9 months after Van Gilder left her job at the Wilkins Air Force Depot. Adam then reached out to one of Sebrin's grandchildren, who promptly supplied him with photographs of Mary Jane Sebrin. Additionally, he obtained a document containing Mary Jane Sebrin's signature from the grandchildren. A comparison of this signature with that of Mary Jane Van Gilder revealed distinct similarities in letter shapes and formatting. The photos indicated a striking resemblance between Mary Jane Sebrin and Mary Jane Van Gilder. In February 2024, a DNA test conclusively confirmed the identity of Mary Jane Sebrin as Mary Jane Van Gilder. According to the grandchildren from her second family, Mary Jane was an exceptional grandmother, passionate about gardening with a fondness for hydrangeas. She enjoyed sun tea and excelled in the culinary arts. Surprisingly, Mary was discovered to be using a different social security number than the one documented in her military file. Mary died from colon cancer in 1990. She was cremated and buried next to her husband. During her final moments, Mary Jane confided in one of her granddaughters, hinting at a secret she could never reveal. Her granddaughter said that she, quote, just assumed that her grandmother was just talking gibberish, but now it all made sense, end quote. Adam expressed how discovering the truth about Mary Jane's fate has been an agonizing experience for the Van Gilder family, who spent decades searching for her. The case of Mary Jane would unearth 2 more mysteries. During the search for Mary Jane, the officer, Adam Turner, found a record of a Jane Doe found in Preble County in the 1960s. The Jane Doe's description resembled that of Mary Jane Van Gilder, prompting the exhumation of her remains in late 2019 for DNA testing. However, the results did not match Mary Jane. But the detective decided to press on and find the identity of Jane Doe. He partnered with Moxie Forensic Investigations to develop a DNA profile and use genetic genealogy to crack the case. Surprisingly, the Preble County Jane Doe turned out to be Albert Frost, a man from Hamilton, Ohio, missing since the early 1960s. Albert's body had been severely decomposed, spread out over about 75 feet, which may have led to the mistake. His cause of death is not determined. Upon contacting Albert's closest DNA relative, his great-niece Tina Barrett, another mystery unfolded. Tina initially thought they were referring to her great-aunt Clara, unaware of Albert's existence. It turned out there were 2 missing siblings in the same family. Albert had a sister named Clara, who also disappeared and was never seen again. She was in her early 20s when she went missing about a decade before Albert in the 1950s. Family members disclosed that Clara's mother had sold her to a man who later became her husband. They had 2 kids together who were just a baby and a toddler when she vanished. Clara's family thought her disappearance was suspicious and told police her husband had been physically abusive to her. Clara's husband denied anything to do with her disappearance and claimed she just ran off. The husband remarried and moved with the children to Pennsylvania. Clara's husband, now deceased, is a suspect in her disappearance.
It was a quiet evening in Dallas when Amber Geiger, a seasoned police officer, entered the wrong apartment. What happened next would send shockwaves through the community, the nation, and change the course of 2 families' lives forever. But was it truly a tragic mistake, or was something darker at play? As the courtroom drama unfolded, questions about race, power, and accountability took center stage. What happened that night, and who was really to blame? Botham Shem Jean was born on September 29, 1991, in Castries, the capital of the island nation of St. Lucia. His parents, Allison and Bertram Jean, were deeply religious and members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Raised in such a faith-driven environment, Botham's upbringing instilled in him strong moral values, including honesty, tolerance, and a desire to help others. These qualities were noted by many who knew him in his lifetime. From a young age, Botham stood out among his peers. His parents raised him with a strong sense of responsibility and a focus on education. In school, he demonstrated exceptional abilities in mathematics and music. At a young age, Botham began singing in the church choir, where his deep and moving voice immediately caught attention. Music became an important part of his life, and the church was a place where he felt supported and confident. After finishing school, Botham decided to continue his education in the United States. He chose to attend Hardin-Simmons University in Texas, where he pursued a degree in accounting. This decision marked an important milestone in his life, as moving to the U.S. opened up new opportunities for professional growth and personal connections. After graduation, Botham secured a job as an accountant in Dallas. His career quickly flourished, and his colleagues highly valued his professionalism and approach to work. For Botham, working at PwC wasn't just a career step, it was an opportunity to contribute to society and provide for his family. He supported his parents, helped the youth in his community in St. Lucia, and dreamed of advancing further in his career. His co-workers remembered him as someone who always brought positivity and inspiration to the team, fostering a strong sense of camaraderie and striving for the best results. But it wasn't just his professional life that mattered to Botham. He was actively involved in the life of his church in Dallas, where he was part of the music group and often spent time with friends from the community. He found joy in simple things, cooking dinners for his friends, organizing parties to maintain friendships, and always sharing his sincere smile and support with others. His life was filled with plans for the future, full of optimism and a drive to achieve even greater things. Amber Geiger, on the other hand, came from a small town near Dallas. She was born on August 9, 1988, and grew up in a family where discipline and hard work were strongly emphasized. From an early age, Amber dreamed of becoming a police officer. Her father worked in local law enforcement, and she knew she wanted to follow in his footsteps to help people and bring order to society. Amber pursued this dream after high school by enrolling in the police academy. She worked hard and demonstrated the discipline and focus needed for a career in law enforcement. After graduating from the academy, Amber began her career with the Dallas Police Department, where she eventually became an officer. Her colleagues described her as determined and hardworking, though she often expressed frustration with the emotional strain and high stress of her job. The life of a police officer is always filled with risk and stress, and Amber was no exception. She often found herself in situations that required quick decisions, where her reaction had to be immediate. These working conditions took a toll on her emotional state. Over time, she became more withdrawn and cautious in her relationships with others, preferring to spend her free time alone to recharge. Amber Geiger was dedicated to her profession, but her life was full of contradictions. She tried to hide her vulnerabilities, but those who knew her well could see that she often felt lonely and sometimes even lost in the world. Despite her strong and determined character, her internal struggles and fatigue from the constant pressure made her life less stable. She would often return home late, exhausted and emotionally drained, which perhaps played a critical role in the tragic events that unfolded later. After moving to Dallas, Amber bought an apartment in a high-rise building not far from her workplace. She hoped that living close to her job would help her rest more and not waste too much time on commuting. Life in Dallas was supposed to be a fresh start for her, but this new beginning didn't bring the peace she had hoped for. Work stress and emotional strain became part of her daily routine. She often found it hard to manage the growing exhaustion, which led to tension and personal issues in her life. September 6, 2018, started for Botham John just like any other day. He woke up early in the morning as usual and headed to his office in downtown Dallas. It was another busy day, filled with meetings, discussions, and preparing reports for clients. Botham was someone who always strived to do his best at work, and this day was no different. His colleagues noticed his upbeat mood and the smile he shared with those around him. No one could have predicted that this would be the last day of his life. After work, Botham returned to his apartment in the Southside Flats complex, located in the heart of Dallas. His apartment was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after a long day. That evening, Botham decided to keep things simple. He planned to cook dinner, play his favorite music, and relax. He loved cooking, and it was one of his ways to relieve the stress of his workday. Meanwhile, Amber Geiger was finishing a 13-hour shift at the police station. That day had been especially grueling for her. Numerous calls, patrolling, and paperwork had completely worn her out. She felt a fatigue that seemed to weigh down her entire body, and all she wanted was to get home as quickly as possible. When her shift finally ended, Amber headed home, eager to collapse into bed and rest. However, her exhaustion and emotional depletion would play a pivotal role in the tragic events that were about to unfold. Amber arrived at her apartment complex, where she lived on the 3rd floor. On her way to her apartment, her attention was distracted as she was scrolling through messages on her phone, reflecting on the day she had just experienced. At some point, she accidentally rode the elevator to the 4th floor instead of her own. The doors to the apartments in this building were similar, and in her tired state, she didn't notice that she had approached the wrong unit. The door to Botham Jean's apartment was slightly ajar, which immediately made her suspicious. In her exhaustion and confusion, she thought someone might have broken into her apartment. Amber drew her service weapon without considering the potential consequences. The only thought in her mind was that she needed to protect herself. She pushed the door open and entered inside. Botham, who was preparing dinner in his apartment, heard the noise. He turned toward the door, unsure of what was happening. Amber, seeing a figure inside, mistook him for an intruder and without hesitation fired twice. The shots echoed through the quiet apartment, and within moments Botham fell to the floor. Amber turned on the lights, and only then realized her mistake. She saw an unfamiliar man lying in a pool of blood, and it hit her that she had entered the wrong apartment. Panic and horror overwhelmed her. She rushed to Botham, trying to administer first aid. She called 911, explaining the situation to the operator, desperately trying to explain that she had entered the wrong unit and had shot someone. Her voice trembled with fear and regret as she pleaded with Botham to hold on, repeatedly saying she hadn't meant for this to happen. While waiting for emergency services to arrive, Amber attempted to stop the bleeding, but her efforts were in vain. Neighbors who had heard the gunshots and cries began to step into the hallway. Some of them also called the police, reporting the gunfire in the apartment complex. Paramedics arrived at the scene and tried to save Botham, but his injuries were fatal. That evening, the life of a young man with so many hopes and dreams was tragically cut short. Amber Geiger was detained at the scene. She appeared to be in a state of shock, completely disoriented, repeating that she hadn't meant for this to happen and that it was a mistake. She was taken to the police station for questioning. The police launched an investigation to understand how this tragedy unfolded. There were many questions. Why hadn't Amber realized she was not in her own apartment? Why had she resorted to using her weapon without confirming that there was an actual threat? These questions became central to the investigation and sparked intense public debate. As investigators gathered evidence, the public began to actively discuss the incident. The case sparked a massive outcry, especially in the context of racial issues and concerns about police abuse of power. Botham Jean was black, and many saw his death as yet another example of unjust treatment and bias by law enforcement. People began to ask, did Botham's race play a role in Amber mistaking him for an intruder and shooting him without attempting to assess the situation? Meanwhile, Botham's family was devastated by the events. His mother, Allison Jean, was in St. Lucia when she learned of the tragedy. It was a crushing blow for her. Her son, who had moved to the U.S. to build a better life, was killed in his own apartment. Allison began to demand justice for her son, calling on the public and authorities for a thorough and impartial investigation. She knew Botham as a kind, responsible, and hardworking person who posed no threat to anyone. In the days following the incident, there was a flood of contradictory reports and rumors. The media extensively covered the case, and public opinion was deeply divided. Some believed Amber had made a tragic mistake, while others argued her actions were the result of bias and an inability to properly assess the situation. Protests and rallies began in Dallas and other cities, with people taking to the streets demanding justice for Botham Jean and his family. During the investigation, it was revealed that Amber Geiger had been exhausted after a long shift and may have been disoriented due to her fatigue. Her defense attorneys argued that she acted in a state of stress and fear for her life. However, the prosecution maintained that her actions were inexcusable for a police officer who should be able to control their emotions and make sound decisions, especially in situations involving the use of a weapon. Witnesses who lived in the apartment complex testified that they heard screams and gunshots. Some of them tried to figure out what was happening, but no one expected such a tragic outcome. Investigators collected evidence, reviewed surveillance footage, and analyzed testimonies to reconstruct the full picture of the events that day. They were trying to determine whether this was truly a tragic mistake or if other factors contributed to such a devastating outcome. After Amber Geiger's arrest, the case entered a new phase, a lengthy and complex process of investigation and trial preparation. Amber was charged with manslaughter. During the investigation, her attorneys argued that her actions were a tragic but unintentional mistake caused by extreme exhaustion following a long shift. However, the prosecution maintained that Amber's actions were unacceptable for a trained police officer who was expected to assess situations carefully and avoid unnecessary use of force. One of the key pieces of evidence was footage from the surveillance cameras at the apartment complex where both Botham Jean and Amber Geiger lived. These recordings helped reconstruct the events of that night. The cameras captured Amber arriving at the building and entering. The footage showed her going to the wrong floor and approaching an apartment that belonged to Botham. Investigators pointed out that she failed to exercise due diligence and did not notice she was on the wrong floor. In addition to the video evidence, phone records played a significant role in the case. Shortly before the incident, Amber had been texting with a colleague with whom she had a personal relationship. Prosecutors argued that these messages might have distracted her and contributed to her failing to realize she was entering the wrong apartment. The defense, however, downplayed the importance of the texts, claiming they were unrelated to the incident and could not have influenced her actions. Over the course of several months, investigators continued gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. Neighbors in the apartment complex provided statements about hearing shouts and gunshots. Some claimed they heard voices before the shots were fired, suggesting there may have been an exchange between Amber and Botham prior to the tragic event. However, witness testimonies varied, making it difficult to piece together a definitive account of what happened. At the same time, forensic examinations were conducted. Experts meticulously analyzed the firearm used in the shooting, as well as the bullet trajectory and other physical evidence, to determine the positions of Amber and Botham at the time of the shooting. One contentious point was the positioning of Botham's body and the angle of the bullet. The prosecution argued that the evidence showed Botham did not pose a threat to Amber, while the defense claimed she acted out of self-defense. In August 2019, a highly publicized trial began, attracting widespread attention from both the public and the media. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, and friends of Botham Jean, as well as supporters of both the prosecution and the defense. The case promised to be a difficult one, touching on issues of police competence, personal responsibility, and racial justice. The trial opened with statements from both the prosecution and the defense. Prosecutors argued that Amber Geiger's actions were not just a mistake, but the result of her negligence as a police officer. They emphasized that any officer should exercise heightened caution, especially when it comes to using a firearm. Furthermore, they pointed out that Botham Jean was in his own home and posed no threat to Amber. The defense, on the other hand, built its case around the idea that Amber was acting out of extreme exhaustion and confusion, driven by fear for her own safety. Her attorney sought to portray her as someone who made a tragic mistake without any malicious intent. They also highlighted her previously unblemished record in law enforcement, hoping to elicit sympathy from the jury. Over the course of several weeks, witnesses, experts, and family members of both the defendant and the deceased testified. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Botham's mother, Allison Jean, took the stand. She spoke about her son's dreams and plans for the future, describing him as a kind and compassionate person. Her words deeply moved everyone in the courtroom, emphasizing the tremendous loss her family had endured. Also testifying was Botham's brother, Brant Jean, whose statement became one of the most talked about moments of the trial. In his address to the court, he publicly forgave Amber Geiger and even asked for permission to hug her. This gesture sparked a range of reactions. Some saw it as an incredible act of kindness and Christian forgiveness, while others felt that such an action should not overshadow the need for fair justice. Among the evidence presented in court were surveillance footage and an audio recording of Amber's 911 call after the shooting. In the recording, she can be heard in a panic, repeatedly stating that she had entered the wrong apartment and never intended to kill anyone. This call sparked further discussion, as it captured her desperation, but also highlighted the lack of any attempt to determine who was in front of her before resorting to using her weapon. The expert testimony focused on analyzing the trajectory of the bullet, the position of Botham Jean's body, and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Experts for the prosecution argued that the bullet's path suggested Botham was in a relaxed position, likely sitting or standing up from his couch when he was shot. This contradicted the defense's claim that he had been moving toward Amber and posed a threat. However, the defense attempted to discredit these conclusions, stating that the trajectory could not be conclusively determined due to a lack of data. Throughout the trial, the public closely followed the developments of the case. Protests and rallies continued, with activists calling not only for a fair sentence for Amber Geiger, but also for police reform to prevent similar incidents in the future. There were widespread calls for changes to police training, especially regarding decision-making skills in high-stress situations, and for greater accountability for mistakes that lead to tragic outcomes. Amber Geiger also took the stand, describing the events of that night from her perspective. She explained how she had come home after a long shift, feeling tired and disoriented. She claimed that she genuinely believed she was in her own apartment and thought Botham was an intruder who had broken into her home. She cried as she spoke, stating that she never intended to harm anyone and that it was a terrible mistake, one that she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Her testimony was emotional and, in the opinion of some, sincere, though it sparked conflicting reactions among the audience. The question of what the appropriate sentence should be became central in the final stage of the trial. Prosecutors insisted that Amber Guyger should be convicted of manslaughter, arguing that her actions led to the death of an innocent person and that a police officer who cannot assess a situation properly should not remain on the force. The defense, on the other hand, requested a lighter sentence, citing the lack of intent and arguing that Amber already carried a heavy burden of guilt for her mistake. After several days of deliberation, the time finally came for the jury to render their verdict in the case of Amber Guyger. Tension filled the courtroom as all eyes were on the judge and jury, who would decide whether the former police officer was guilty of causing Botham Jean's death. For many, this trial had become a symbol not just of a personal tragedy but also of the deep-rooted issues within American society: racial bias, abuse of power, and a lack of accountability within law enforcement. On October 2, 2019, the jury announced their verdict. Amber Guyger was found guilty of the crime that resulted in Botham Jean's death. This decision came as a surprise to many, particularly since the prosecution had initially sought a conviction for manslaughter. The charge of murder carried more serious consequences and a longer prison sentence. In the courtroom, there were audible expressions of relief and quiet celebrations. This verdict was a significant step toward justice for Botham's family and those who had supported them throughout the long and painful trial. The following day, the judge delivered the sentence. Amber Guyger was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In her statement, the judge acknowledged the complexity and tragedy of the case, emphasizing that both sides had experienced significant loss. Guyger, the judge noted, had made a grave error that cost an innocent person his life. However, despite the weight of the sentence, many felt that 10 years was too lenient for a life lost as a result of such a severe mistake. While some were satisfied with the court's decision, others believed it fell short. Activists and supporters of the Jean family argued that the sentence did not reflect the gravity of the crime and was not enough punishment for the life that had been taken. Protests continued in Dallas and other cities, with many calling for further reforms in the criminal justice and law enforcement systems. This case became a symbol of the fight for justice and brought renewed attention to the challenges Black Americans face in interactions with law enforcement. Amber Guyger herself remained in shock following the verdict and sentencing. She repeatedly stated that she had no intention of harming anyone and that it was a terrible mistake. Her attorneys filed an appeal, hoping to reduce her sentence. They argued that 10 years was too harsh for someone who acted out of confusion, stress, and exhaustion. However, as the trial concluded, Guyger was taken into custody to begin serving her sentence. Botham Jean's family expressed their gratitude to everyone who supported them throughout the long months of the trial. Botham's mother, Allison Jean, stated that while the verdict provided some sense of resolution, it could never bring back her son. She emphasized the need for systemic reforms in the justice system and law enforcement to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. Allison continued to advocate for change within police departments, hoping her son's case would serve as a catalyst for meaningful progress. The case of Botham Jean had a profound impact on public opinion and the national conversation around policing. This incident became yet another example highlighting systemic issues in law enforcement and the treatment of Black citizens. In response to public pressure, several states began considering legislative initiatives aimed at improving police training, particularly in situations involving the use of force and community interactions. Calls grew louder for increased accountability for officers' actions, and mandatory training programs focused on racial and cultural competency. Additionally, the Botham Jean case inspired the creation of organizations and funds dedicated to supporting families of victims of police misconduct and advocating for law enforcement reform. These groups provided legal and emotional support while spearheading campaigns to raise awareness about racial discrimination and abuse of power. Allison Jean became an active participant in these initiatives, using her personal story to fight for justice and systemic change. As time passed, Amber Guyger continued to serve her sentence in prison while awaiting the outcome of her appeal. This case not only shattered the lives of two families, but also left a lasting mark on American society. The tragic mistake that led to Botham Jean's death served as a stark reminder of the need for reform and the importance of law enforcement officials making sound and responsible decisions, especially in life-and-death situations. The story of Botham Jean and Amber Guyger remains one of the most discussed and impactful cases in recent U.S. history. It underscores the profound consequences of poor judgment, particularly when exercised by those in positions of power. While justice, according to many, was only partially achieved, the case left unanswered questions and became a symbol of the ongoing fight for equality and accountability in America. And that wraps up today's chilling story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Also, let me know in the comments what part of this story shocked you the most. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Marlene Warren. When a clown appeared at Marlene Warren's door with flowers and balloons, she had no idea that the clown was carrying a gun hidden inside the costume. For over 30 years, the case of the killer clown baffled detectives, Florida residents, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Marlene Warren was born on April 15, 1950. At the age of 22, she married Michael Warren, who was 19 at the time. Marlene already had 2 children from a previous marriage, and Michael appeared to embrace her sons as his own. The couple worked hard and built a life together, purchasing several businesses, including a used car dealership for Michael. Their efforts allowed them to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, and they were able to afford a 6,500 square foot home in Wellington, Florida's upscale Aero Club neighborhood. Each home in this community had its own runway and hangar, offering residents the freedom to fly their private aircraft at will. The Warrens appeared to have it all, yet this was not the case at all. At his auto dealership in 1983, Michael experienced legal troubles. Customers accused him of fiddling with the odometer, and the authorities arrested him. He was consequently given an 18-month probationary period. By the year 1990, it was widely known that the Warrens were experiencing marital issues. Michael was allegedly having an affair with Sheila Keene, one of his employees. Despite their denials, Sheila's husband eventually left her. On May 26, 1990, a white Chrysler LeBaron without a license plate drove down the street where Michael and Marlene lived. Marlene and a friend were in the kitchen when they saw a person dressed as a clown, holding a basket of flowers and balloons, approaching their front door. Marlene grew up in a family that had a deep love for clowns. Her family adored clowns so much that her mother had a room dedicated to clown collectibles, including paintings Marlene had made when she was just 14. With this deep connection to clowns, Marlene eagerly went to the front door to greet her visitor. Her son, Joseph Aarons, who was there at the time, recalled hearing his mother comment, "How pretty," as she opened the door. Those would appear to be her last words. Shortly after, everyone in the house, including Joseph's friends who were visiting, heard a loud pop sound. At first they thought the noise was a balloon popping, but then they noticed Marlene tumbling to the ground. Now at alert, everyone sped to the door. The balloons and flowers were left behind as the clown nonchalantly made his way back to the white Chrysler LeBaron. Joseph tried to run after the clown, but he couldn't go as far because he had a cast on his leg. He, however, remembered screaming at the clown to turn around. The clown turned and gave him a wide-eyed brown stare. His face lacked any expression. The clown soon climbed the white LeBaron and sped off. The sole description offered by witnesses was that Marlene had been shot by a clown with brown eyes. Even the gender of the clown was a mystery to them. Joseph and one of his friends had tried to follow the clown in their own car, but they lost track of it. Marlene Warren was rushed to the hospital. It was determined that she had been shot twice in the face at point-blank range. She struggled to survive but died 2 days later at the hospital. Detectives checked in with Michael Warren, who wasn't home at the time of the incident. Michael had a solid alibi. He got the terrible news while en route to a Miami racetrack with France. He hastily went back home to offer comfort to the family. When questioned by the detectives, he provided as much information cooperating with the investigation process. He was soon ruled out as a suspect. The authorities were perplexed. According to a spokesman for the Palm Beach County Sheriff, the killer clown case was the strangest thing he had ever seen in all of his 19 years working as a law enforcement agent. 2 hours after the murder, authorities got a solid tip. A caller who wished to remain unnamed suggested that the police should thoroughly question Michael Warren and Sheila Keene. Before the police could ask her any more questions, she hung up. Sheila Keene was in town at the time of the murder, but Michael was traveling with France. Sheila claimed to have been at work, but in reality, she was a repoed person from Michael's dealership. Her alibi wasn't exactly solid. A few days after Marlene Warren's killer clown case made headlines, 2 employees of the neighborhood costume store named the Spotlight reported a weird experience to the police. They claimed that one woman with chocolate brown hair came up to them just as they were to lock up the store. She pleaded to be allowed inside. The employees informed her that they were closed and advised her to come back the following day. She, however, was persistent and informed them that she really needed a costume that evening. It was a strange request because it wasn't Halloween. It was almost Labor Day weekend. Regardless, the 2 employees were sympathetic and allowed her enter the store. She was claimed to have bought white makeup, a red nose, white gloves, an orange afro wig and a clown outfit. Later on in the investigation, the two employees selected Sheila Keene from a lineup of photos and declared that they were fairly certain that she was the woman who showed up begging to buy a clown costume. The detective soon looked into the supermarket store that sold the flowers and balloons the clown had brought to Marlene's house. It was discovered that the supermarket was close to Sheila Keene's house at the time. Also, the supermarket staff selected Sheila from a lineup of photos. The white Chrysler LeBaron, the getaway vehicle, came into consideration next. When asked, Michael Warren asserted that he had no knowledge of the vehicle. He claimed only Chevrolets were sold at his dealership, but Payless, his main rival, had a Chrysler LeBaron. Michael and Payless had a history of disagreements, especially over an advertisement that Michael's dealership ran that included the phrase Payless and was purported to be an attempt to confuse buyers. One time, a client from outside the area rented a white Chrysler LeBaron from Palace. The customer searched up Palace's number when it was time to return the car, but ended up contacting Michael's dealership instead. The client said they were instructed to park the vehicle outside the dealership with the keys inside the sun visor. The LeBaron, however, later vanished. After the murder, the getaway vehicle used by the clown was abandoned in a grocery store parking lot. During their search, police discovered orange synthetic threads in the vehicle that resembled a clown wig strands. They also discovered brown long hairs. Sheila Keene had long brown hair at the time of the murder. The police found more orange fake hair strands inside her residence during a search warrant. At this point, everything seemed like a simple situation to resolve, but that wasn't the case. Michael and Sheila vehemently denied being involved in Marlene's murder. They refuted having a conversation with the police without the presence of a lawyer. DNA testing was just getting started in 1990, so the investigators' available evidence was circumstantial. The investigation into Marlene's murder was abandoned, but Michael's legal issues intensified. During the course of the investigation into the murder, Michael's unlawful business dealings came to light. Police discovered proof of additional odometer tampering and consumer overcharging. Following the arrest of an employee, Michael surrendered himself to the police. In 1992, Michael's case went to trial and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. After being released in February 2002, Michael married Sheila Keene a few years later. The couple started a new life in Tennessee by operating a restaurant. Sheila changed her name to Debbie and informed the community that it was a childhood nickname. Michael must be a good businessman because his new restaurant was a success. The couple's success allowed them to settle in Heron Point, a posh neighborhood close to the Virginia-Tennessee border. They made lots of friends and fit in well with their new neighbors. Few locals were familiar with their history. Michael told their new community that he has owned restaurants since he was a teenager. Marlene Warren's demise benefited Michael as well. He was the beneficiary of Marlene's life insurance policy, not her son. He took over $50,000 from Marlene's family, leaving them with virtually nothing. Detectives had their suspicions, but there was no concrete proof on ground. Michael and Sheila were immediately suspected of the crime, but a grand jury was never convened to that effect. Earlier in the investigation, the police were informed by Michael's acquaintances that they had seen arguments between him and Marlene, and that Marlene had questioned Sheila about her and Michael's affair. Above all, they claimed Michael didn't seem overly saddened by Marlene's passing. Detectives knew they merely needed to fit the puzzle pieces together because there were many of them. DNA was the case's linchpin. Police took blood and hair samples from Sheila in 1990, but they lacked the equipment to analyze them. Over 25 years passed as the samples rested in a cooler. Police were able to reactivate Marlene Warren's cold case in 2013, thanks to a federal grant they were able to obtain. They had previously tried DNA testing, but the results were inconclusive. Fortunately, technology has improved and produced sufficient evidence to charge Sheila for Marlene's murder. In September 2017, Michael and Sheila were stopped by authorities 5 minutes away from their home. They were unaware that Marlene Warren's cold case had been reopened. 27 years after the murder, the police informed them that an arrest warrant had been issued for Sheila Keene Warren. Michael Warren still maintains that neither he nor Sheila are involved. In an interview, when questioned if he was involved in the killing of his first wife, Michael replied with definitely not. He further said he wouldn't have been with Sheila if he thought she had anything to do with Marlene's murder. A lawyer named Christopher DeSantis told detectives about a fascinating chat he had with Michael Warren before Marlene was killed. DeSantis claimed that Michael had questioned him about what would happen theoretically speaking if a husband murdered his wife. He recalled telling Michael that the husband would escape punishment if a friend of his committed the murder, and there was no way to connect the husband to the friend. Interestingly, DeSantis also remembered telling Michael that if someone were dressed as a clown, they would likely get away with it because it would be impossible to identify them. However, despite this statement, the evidence was not enough for the police to accuse Michael Warren of his wife Marlene's murder. Marlene's son, Joseph Aarons, who was a teenager when his mother was killed, recalled that day as one of the worst of his life. In an interview, he expressed a desire for justice but refrained from stating whether he believed his stepfather, Michael, was involved in his mother's death. Sheila was incarcerated for 5 years before her trial began. During this time, she and Michael's relationship continued, with the two exchanging several letters. Ultimately, Sheila Keene pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 12 years in prison.